Hello, and welcome to the lecture about the Industrial Revolution and the Victorians. I want to get started by starting in week 2. It's going to look a little bit different from your screen, but hopefully it'll be pretty good. So in steampunk, it is a reaction to our modern times. Steampunks tend to choose the aesthetic of the Victorians, but again, with the retro twist, as we saw last week, a retro-futuristic twist, I should say. They want to modernize what the Victorians have done. So generally speaking, steampunk punks will choose Victorian clothing, Victorian styles of things, and they will add a modern retro-future addition to it. They will make it, uh, they will enhance it with science that never existed. For example, various steampunk goggles that have different lenses that allow you to see different things that normally through our normal scientific ways wouldn't be able to be seen. Um, or, for example, ray guns as a weapon, or time travel, since we haven't actually perfected that yet, or airships that sail in the sky based on steam and wind power, and lots of other different things. So all of this for us in modernity, for steampunk, is a reaction to uh, everything that is sterile in our modern time, which, let's face it, our electronics are are pretty sterile, right? Um, our computers just kind of sit there and don't really have much to do with anything. They just kind of sit there and don't really make much noise unless we're playing a game or we're playing music or making them make a noise. They silently run and do what they're supposed to do, which is great. But there's no life to it. And steampunks are very much all about the animus that makes things go. In other words, the spark of life that things seem to have when there are moving parts that you can see. For example, in an engine, if you were to look at the inside of an engine while it's running, you have all the various pistons going up and down with the camshaft turning them, and the explosions causing everything to keep going, the combustion engine, which is a little bit different from the steam engine. Steam engine uh, is turned, heats the steam up, the steam causes everything to turn and different valves move and move the steam along its way, and that's what sends it to other things. But in any case, like I said, all of this is a reaction to our modern technology. Well, in that same way, the Victorians were reacting to what happened with them and their technology was the Industrial Revolution. But I'm probably getting a little bit far ahead of myself. So first, before anything, please accept my apologies for any of the quality of this particular audio or video. Uh, I'm having troubles with my desktop PC, which is my performance PC, if you will, my gaming PC, and how I record everything usually. So I'm having to record this on my laptop, which is a pretty decent machine, but still not the best. So I apologize. It's going to take me a little bit to flip through screens a little bit differently, so please have some patience. All right, so we're going to talk about the Victorians. And the Victorian era it starts roughly with Queen Victoria coming to power in 1837. She was just slightly older, an older teenager when she came to power as queen. And she lived to be fairly old, into her 70s. She died in 1901. So technically the Victorian era is from 1837 to 1901. That was her reign in England. But most historians consider the time frame of about 1820 to 1914 to really be the Victorian era. A little bit before her reign and a few years after her death uh, is what we consider Victorian. And it was named for her because at the time she was possibly the most famous person in the world. As the reigning monarch of England, which was an imperialistic empire, in other words, they went all over the world seeking out new places to, I guess, colonize, conquer, trade with, much like the Romans before them. Um, she just became the most famous monarch as she had so many subjects under her, as so many countries came under the rule of the British Empire. So that being said, she was also, people look to her to be the social guide. Much like we have Instagram today and we have influencers, you can consider Queen Elizabeth, I'm sorry, not Queen Elizabeth, Queen Victoria to be the number one influencer of her time, basically. So most people were interested in what the Queen wore and what she ate and what she did for her leisure time and where she traveled to and what she thought. And it's actually quite like that still to this day with countries that have a monarchy or some kind of monarchical system. You'll find that much of the royalty is still on their currency, the, such as Queen Elizabeth is on the Canadian and the Australian and the English currency. And you have the Dutch royalty and the royalty in Monaco, not to mention Saudi Arabian princes and some other petty nobility throughout Europe. So it's not unheard of. So like I said, if you think of Queen Victoria as being the number one influencer of her time, that's a good way to think of it. So the Industrial Revolution, what I've given you in the in our week module here is this link to the Industrial Revolution, the rise of, and the rise of Victorians, and it is a great basic introduction to what the Industrial Revolution was. And I'm going to try and share that with you now. Again, apologies for the clunkiness with which I have to do this because of how this works, and I have to unshare and then share again. It's just not very elegant here on the laptop. Sorry. Oh, Chrome tab, sorry. Here we go. We're going to go look at the Industrial Revolution page. I do want you guys to take a look at this and read it from top to bottom, but I want to show it to you while I'm talking to you just a little bit. So the Industrial Revolution uh, started well before Victoria's time, somewhere in 1760, which was about 50 years or so before she came into power. Um, Actually, yeah, 50, 60 years before she came into power. And it began the process which changed their future, changed Europe's future, changed America's future. We would not have the things we have today were it not for the Industrial Revolution. It was a time of unprecedented technological development. And you can watch this great video here. I'll tell you all about it, how it changed the world. But it started with the use of new materials. Then the coal-powered coal was a fuel for use of power. Then steam, which was huge, which of course we're concerned with because steam is great. It's a fairly clean energy, although to get it is not necessarily, because usually you'll burn coal or some other fuel to make the steam that will power everything. And then of course electricity, petroleum, and now the internal combustion engine. So it all started with a jenny or a spinning jenny or a power loom, which was in textile manufacturing. Someone created a power loom that made it faster to weave fabrics. And if you don't think that's important, think about this. Before this was made, before this was created, every scrap of cloth ever worn by anyone had to be woven by hand. Everything was done by hand, from either gathering wool or cotton, as the case may be, and matting it out, turning it, spinning it into thread, so that yarn and then thread, and then those weaving those bits of yarn and thread into a fabric that could then be cut and put together with other fabrics and sewn together to create clothes. All of this was done by hand, and it was an incredibly arduous and labor intensive thing, but we had to have clothes as human beings, right? We have to be covered, whether it was with cloth or animal leather or fur. And all of these things were labor intensive, and with the creation of the power loom, the spinning jenny and the power loom, this completely revolutionized how fabrics were produced. Um, before these fabrics, or before these creations, fabric was incredibly expensive. You didn't own that many clothes because it was hard to come by cloth. You patch things up constantly. I mean, you still do this. We still patch things up to this day, but you handed clothes down. They were made to last. You had a lot of things in it that didn't wear out, like leather, fur. Also, the climate had to do with that. Um, and you just didn't have that many clothes. And you were careful with your washing of them. You took excellent care of your clothes because, or as best you could, because they had to last you because they were not cheap and they were hard to come by. With the loom and the industrialization of that, it became faster and easier to make it, and thereby a little bit cheaper. Now, not as cheap as clothes are for us today. We tend to have the problem of having too many clothes today in our day and age. So much so that we send our unwanted clothes to third world countries who then have stockpiles of unwanted clothes. Um, the rag industry used to be much bigger than it was, but there's just everything. There's so many rags. We tend to just throw away or discard clothing. Uh, a lot of places won't take it. In times of emergency, one of the first things people want to donate are clothes, and it's gotten to where it's overwhelming a lot of times, and this is why places started asking for donations of cash uh, instead of clothing or other items, because it's just too much, because we have too much, because it's so cheap to make. Um, if it if you are ever in doubt, take a look around the internet and see if you can find pictures of third world country residents wearing shirts from the wrong championship winners. For example, like the NBA championship. Whoever the loser was last year, or even MLB, or any of these championships, Super Bowl, how do they have those shirts before right as soon as they're doing the ticker tape, before all the ticker tape and all the confetti has settled, uh, at the awards ceremony after the game, they all have brand new shirts that say, world champion on them, right? Well, the sad truth is that thousands of shirts are printed up for both teams that say world champion on them. It doesn't matter what it is. And those shirts are they're pre-printed up so that they can start giving them out and start selling them as soon as that last buzzer goes off, right? As soon as that game is over, they're ready to sell this merchandise because people want to buy it. If anybody remembers when the last time the Astros won the World Series, man, we had those shirts. Boom, less than an hour, people had those shirts. And the sad reason is because they print up shirts for both sides, as if both teams won. So what happens to all the shirts that are for the team that didn't win, that are inaccurate? Well, 9 times out of 10, they box all those shirts up and they send them off to a third world country, or they send them off to be made into rags. Absolutely brand new shirts, just printed. The only thing wrong with them is they have the wrong team on them that won. And that's why you'll see that. You'll see it on the internet. You'll see it if you go to the country. They're wearing T-shirts that just didn't make any sense. Also, if there's ever a printing problem, they'll do the same thing, where maybe an inappropriate word was put on there where it wasn't supposed to be, or something to that effect. You'll see a lot of that. In any case, clothing is cheap now because of the Industrial Revolution. So I will move on. I tend to wax eloquent about some of this stuff. Um, but the Industrial Revolution, as you'll read here, it created, it totally changed society from the top down. Before the Industrial Revolution, in England, you had a more feudalistic society. You had most of your people lived in the countryside. You had people who lived in the cities, but the cities were not lovely places. They were not good. They were not great places to be. They were places where you went on market day to go trade your goods, and then you went back out to your farm or your country or your landscape to live, because the country was not a pleasant place. They were seats of power, and they were seats of profit. And, they still kind of are. But you had a feudalistic society where you had someone who owned a large portion of land, let's say the landowner, or usually the nobility at the time, owned a large farm, plantation, acreage. They needed people to work that farm, or, tend to the sheep or whatever they were raising there. They needed people, and those were the country peasantry who tended to live. They had a place on the nobles' land that they were, where they had their own place to live, and they were well taken care of, usually by the nobility, in exchange for working the land, for working crops, working animals, helping out around the homestead, and I say homestead, more like, whatever the noble's house was, the manor. Um, they got to live on the land. They got to share in the food that was raised. They were taken care of. They were cared for when they were sick. It was in the noble's best interest to keep those people happy and healthy as much as they could, because it was a symbiotic relationship. Feudalism was. Now, could those people ever own anything on their own? No, not necessarily. I mean, they own their personal items, but they were probably never going to own a parcel of land because of simply how they were born. And a lot of people left for the cities. Younger people would leave to the cities to seek their fortune elsewhere, but often they would return back to the nobility's land and work for them. This worked out fairly okay for decades, hundreds of years probably, until about 1760, when the loom was invented. The Industrial Revolution was begun, and once they started creating uh, things like the loom and the spinning jenny, they started trying to apply this technology to other machines that could do other things, and they found great success with it, and most of it was powered by steam. So what you had happening was you had factories opening up, places where you could make large-scale amounts of things fairly cheaply. Things that usually were made by hand previously could now be made on machines or by machines, either partially or entirely. Um, and the machines were not like robots of our day. Uh, the machines today that we have doing things can usually do what they need to do with very minimal human input. The machines of their day required people to watch them, feed them materials, unclog anything that got messed up, fix anything that started to go wrong. So there was a lot of humans needed to work around and with the machines, but the machines did the majority of the work. Um, thus thus freeing up humans to do more supervisory kind of things with that. So when these factories opened, they needed people. They needed people to work the machines. They needed people to move the things. They needed people to do. So as more and more young people started leaving the countryside to seek their fortunes uh, in the cities, they started having an overflux of people. I mean, the cities were not really designed to start keeping people like this. And so you had the problems of slums come up, and you had living conditions that were bad. And also the agrarian nobility started losing out. They started losing people. There wasn't anybody to work the farms. It was getting harder and harder because nobody wanted to stay in the country. People wanted to go to the city and make their own fortune. They wanted to own their own farm at some point, or their own plot, or their own business. And that's that drive of ownership that we pretty much know so well as Americans. Um, but it created a lot of problems in London society. But it also created a new tier of social economic people, and that was the middle class. You'd always had your nobility who had money and owned land. Now, as you started to see people move away from the nobility and go to the cities, a lot of the nobles, they couldn't produce like they had in the past, and they started losing money. So really, towards the end, they didn't have very much money, but they had a lot of land, and they were still considered noble. And then you had the middle class being created by the Industrial Revolution, people who owned the factories or had a big share in the factories or had something to do with the factory work, started to make their own money. And they became what we call the nouveau riche, the new rich. In other words, their money didn't come from nobility or ancestry or anything like that. Their money was made with capitalism. Um, they found a way to create a product cheaper and sold a lot of it and started to do better, and they brought themselves up, and they became the middle class. And most of the Victorians, when we hear Victorians and we see Victorians and story about Victorians, things that we are seeing and hearing are about the middle class Victorians, who we'll talk about. Now, this was great. This was great for the middle class. We started seeing, the Industrial Revolution allowed people to have money. It also gave them a lot of time on their hands. Um, they had a lot of leisure time to deal with things, but mostly they had money. And that was something new and different. And like I said, it created a problem with the nobility because people started equating, I guess, respect for other people, for other people's stations. They started taking it away so much from the people who had always been noble and had the respect of people to giving it to those who had money. It's kind of what we see today. Who are our people that we respect the most? Well, unfortunately, a lot of it has to do with how much money you have. In America, if you have a lot of money, people tend to listen to you. I'm not sure why. I guess because you have money and you may be able to do something with that. Or people need or want that money and they figure you'll help them out with it uh, if you have it. So this is kind of where that idea started. I mean, we always respected the king in the past because usually the king had more money than anybody else, but maybe that's a thing. But in any case, you had this new class being created in the Victorians, and well, really two classes. You had the middle class and you had the working class. And the working class were all these people who had formerly been working for the nobility out on their farms and their homesteads out in the country, who would now come to the city to make their fortune working in the factories because they could make their own money. And anything that they made working at the factories was theirs to keep. After they paid all their bills, of course, like paying the landlord of whoever, wherever they were staying. And those places were kind of awful. Um, they had things like window taxes in London, uh, where the landlord was taxed for the number of windows that they had in the building. So in order to not pay so many taxes, many landlords just bricked up the windows in their buildings. And the people who were living there, well, they just had to suffer through not having any windows or fresh air or a view because the landlord didn't want to pay those taxes. And I mean, who can blame him? But uh, so that made conditions living in these places a little more squalid. Always having to have to burn something to be able to see is kind of a hard way to live. Um, but that was one of the, it was just people living on top of people was never good. You also had situations where if you had shift workers, uh, or people who worked during the day with people who worked at night, they might share the exact same room, apartment, or bed, where the person who worked during the day would sleep during the, sleep at night, and the person who worked during at night would sleep during the day. And yeah, I mean, that just is not very pleasant, but it's how people lived until they could make ends meet. And also you had in these factories people working, it wasn't just men, but women and children too. And in fact, women and children were often sought out over the men for lots of different reasons. But the biggest reason was because they were smaller and they had smaller hands. For example, children were sometimes completely sought after because they could reach in amongst the machinery. They could actually get into some of these machines. They were so big, and clear out uh, debris that had fallen in, or clear up any problems that occurred, and hopefully get out in time before the machine unbound itself and started going again. Often that was not the case, and sadly, many children were maimed or even killed by these machines because they were being used to work in these. Now, this is why we have child labor laws to this day, but that's where it started. So, you know, the Victorians, these people were very practical. It was they needed to produce something, and it didn't really matter who got in the way as long as whatever it was that was being produced was finished. So you have some pretty interesting and not really great working conditions due to these factories. And so you saw the rise of, like I said, the middle class and the working class. And but you also saw the rise of other things, and how the Victorians reacted to the Industrial Revolution is just as important. And one of the things that we look at, because it is sort of mirrors a little bit, not completely, how we look at our technology. So, for example, the one of the other things I want you guys to look at is the Victorian era. It's another website. I want you to read all the way through it. But um, this specifically starts talking about all the different things that were going on in the Victorian times. Now, again, I was talking about reactions. Victorians started reacting to the Industrial Revolution. It was the best thing that ever happened to them, and it was the worst thing that ever happened to them. And they had very different reactions. Um, for one thing, one of the things that they started were charitable works. There were lots of organizations that came out of all of the bad things that were happening during the Industrial Revolution. Again, don't get me wrong, there were many, many great things that came out of the Industrial Revolution, but there were bad things as well. Um, but you had charitable work starting out. A lot of soup kitchens started out because while these people were working for these factories and making their own money and trying to see their way through life, they were used to having the nobility take care of them, and having to do this all on their own and have money of their own to pay for things that they wanted on their own was sort of a new concept in many ways. And a lot of people didn't do very well with it. They lost all their money very quickly to grifters or scammers, just kind of like we still have today, or they simply just did not have good money management skills, or things were just so expensive or scarce due to the number of people that had influxed into London and other places at this time. The infrastructure in the cities couldn't quite catch up, so you often had shortages and things. But you had charitable organizations starting up that would that looked to help these people, help them with food, with shelter, help with the children, because not all the children went to work. if you had a baby and you were a worker in a factory, you were expected to either be able to work with that baby and not lose a beat, or leave that baby somewhere. And daycare was simply not a thing in Victorian England unless you were one of the middle class Victorians who had a family, who could afford a nanny, whose mother stayed home and didn't work. Um, Many workers would leave their children at home, their brand new infants at home during the day, and they would leave them with, uh, bottles of milk. They didn't have formula back then. They also didn't really have a way to pump or keep breast milk, so they would start them early on a form of milk and gruel in their bottles, but they would also leave them with either gin mixed into that or bottles of watered down gin, because it was a cheap alcohol they could get. And generally speaking, it would inebriate the baby, and they would either sleep it off, or they would, at least it would keep them quiet and, you know, drunk basically for most of the time that their parents were gone, until they could get home and take care of them. And that is an actual thing that happened, and it is kind of sad and horrific for us to think of it. Ah, there we go. And we're back. Sorry. I moved and everything went off because of where I'm doing this. So sorry. In any case, gin babies actually happened. It was a thing. It's pretty horrific. I think that's where I clicked off on that. So the Victorians' reaction continued. You had charitable works. You had that started. It became a much bigger thing than it is. You had a lot of these Victorians with all this extra time and money looking towards reasons why. So you had, and they looked for ways that they could help or they could react to things. And most of that, well, I mean, one of the things we are reading right now, The Time Machine, written by H.G. Wells, hopefully y'all are still reading that, was a reaction to what was going on with the Industrial Revolution and how people were being treated. And it was H.G. Wells's idea of what was going to happen in the future if things didn't change. So you had a lot of writing going on. There were pamphlets, there were brochures, people were trying to bring awareness and action to help other people. You had poverty laws that came into effect, uh, some good, some bad. You had the idea of poverty jail. If you couldn't pay your debts, you were put in jail, which just made it worse, right? Because how could you pay your debts if you were in jail? Um, So you had some of that come to fruition that time. You had unions start up. We started seeing unions with the Industrial Revolution, and workers in factories. You started to see unions. And unions were simply people who were standing up for workers' rights and their rights to uh, better working conditions and safer working conditions. And this is where you saw, this was all before the EPA or OSHA or anything quite like that. So you saw the rise of unions. Um, you saw, like I said, the rise of the middle class, but also workers. And workers who were fortunate enough to save up some money could actually change their fate. And a lot of them took to other places when they felt like they had used up all their opportunities in England. So you saw a large influx of immigration to America by Irish and Scottish and other people who just wanted to, change their stars and go to America, because there was so much land in America and it was there for the taking, basically, at this time. Um, you saw you saw there's just a movement to try to make things make things better. Once, it kind of hit rock bottom. Once you started having all the filth in the streets from simply all the people simply living up, like on top of each other. Um, you saw things like the plumbing and the sewer systems being improved or trying to be. And in many places in London, they still have the Victorian sewer systems, which is crazy to think about it. Um, but there were large projects to help put people to work, but also to public work things, just to make things better. So you didn't have raw sewage running through the middle of the street. You had street sweepers. You had the light, the people who would light the lamp posts. Those were all gas, and they would light them at dark, and they would put them out at dawn, so people could see. Like I said, the street sweepers, literally people who were assigned to certain parts of streets that they just went through and swept all the horse dung and just dirt from the street where the horses were, because if you have a lot of horse-drawn carriages, you're going to have a lot of horse manure. That's just how that works. But you also saw, finally, as a reaction to everything, you saw the arts and crafts movement come to fruition. And I'm going to pause it for just a second. Okay, sorry about that. Emergency, trying to get this done for you guys. I am so sorry. In any case, so the uprise of the artisan and craftsman movement, and that is where you had Victorians who decided they didn't like their items being produced in a mass production line in the factories, and so they started making things by hand again. And we've actually seen this ourselves here lately, particularly with some of the COVID activities. But before the COVID activities, with the rise of like websites like Etsy, where things are handmade, um, people have gone from, they're tired of things being mass produced and injection molded plastic and cheap junk, and they want things that are handmade, hand carved, hand poured. Um, and so we kind of, we have that same reaction. In any case, I know I keep just kind of sitting on these one pages, but you saw the rise of a lot of that. There were other new things that happened in the Victorian age that are worth noting, and that is things like electricity came about, because despite the fact that we had steam, we we also saw the rise of electricity and the use of electricity. Victorians had electricity. They not all Victorians, but a lot of the middle class Victorians, the people who were making money with those factories or in management of those factories, had their houses wired for electricity, because it was very novel to have a few electronic lights around the house. Um, you also saw, well, there's everything that electricity brings with that too. I mean, so this is, you also saw the beginning of people staying up later into the night, disrupting our natural circadian rhythms, and what some people would argue our better sleep system that we once upon a time had, where we would go home, go to bed at dusk when the sun went down. We'd go to bed for a few hours, wake up towards the middle of the night, stay up for a couple hours, do whatever we want to do, visit, eat, do what people do in the middle of the night, and then go back to sleep and wake up at dawn. And that apparently is actually a much more natural rhythm than we even were aware of. But with the advent of electricity, people were able to stay up later. They didn't have to burn so many candles or light oil lamps to keep awake. They could just flip a light on and it stayed on. And you could do things like read and entertain by that light, and then you could just go to bed later and you wouldn't have that second staying up time. So lots of things changed. A new nightlife was brought on, and everything that electricity brings. Because much like what happened with the steam machines, or machines that were run by steam, when after the loom was created, things started to run on electricity, and that was kind of exciting. So in any case, that's what you have. A lot of change with the Victorians, and you can read more about it in the Victorian assignment and on that website. And um, it's all quite, it's all exactly a reaction to their modernity, much like steampunk is a reaction to ours. I did want to talk a little bit more about them. The Victorians had a lot of free time. Like I said, they could turn to more leisurely pursuits as well as social work. More people had money, but they had less property. Um, but as more people had money and property became less important because there was less to go around, they started demanding the ability to do things like vote. Because for a long time, it was only the nobility or landowners could vote. But once they realized that people could have money and influence without owning too much land, um, they started feeling like they should have a voice in their government. And so there were some changes to voting at that time. Also, you had the growth of the British Empire. Now, the British Empire was sort of had modeled itself on the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had been in Britain for hundreds of years. And when Rome fell, finally, and Rome withdrew from England, they left with them all of their ways of government. This is all that the British people had ever known, was how Rome was. So they modeled themselves on Rome. And much like Rome, Britain realized that there were many things out in the world that they couldn't get, especially once Rome withdrew and they were no longer supplying Britain with a lot of these things. Britain had to start making trade with other countries on their own. So Britain, being a naval country, set out in the world. Also, they had the influence of the Norsemen who had been started coming to Britain and raiding. So you had the Vikings coming in with their influence. Once everybody kind of settled down and blended, England started going out in the world and looking for things on its own, and thus began the uh, English, I guess, conquest. I don't know if it's conquest. It became the English Empire, really the imperialistic nature. So when we think of the English Empire going out, making colonies, for example, America was one of them at the time, way back in the 1600s. England started doing that all over the world. It wasn't just America. Uh, so by the time Victorian era rolled around, England had huge amounts of trading and colonies everywhere, and principalities, and they believe they owned places. And you can read all about that. When we talk about colonization, that's what we're talking about, is the English imperialism. But without this English imperialism, we wouldn't have many of the things that we do now, and the world wouldn't have many of the things that they do now. And honestly, again, that's why Victoria was known all over the place, was because of the English imperialism. She was the monarch for a huge amount of people on the planet, whether they liked it or not. But right around the time of, I guess I want to say midway through her reign, the imperialism started to slack off, and the empire had started to shrink as more and more people, like America, rose up against Britain, and chose independence. And you know you can read all about that too. But it was just a really interesting time in terms of the imperialism and how it worked, and how it was actually starting to retreat towards the end of the era. One other thing that was very important uh, during the Victorian time was the idea of Darwinism. So Charles Darwin, as you see here, uh, was, he was an older man in 1881, but he traveled to the Isle of Galapagos Isles, and he wrote this book, and he in it he explained his theory of evolution, and that would be how animals had evolved to where they lived from other ways. Like they may have started out one way and they ended up a different way because of what food that was available to them, or the predators, or how they lived wherever it was that they were living. And so he developed this theory of evolution, which was a direct argument against uh, creationism, which is what religion was teaching at the time and still does. Um, and this was revolutionary. This idea that man could have evolved from primates um, was new and different, and as you can imagine, kind of out there. But some people really took fascination to it, and some people took a real offense at it. In any case, it began a lot of conversations with a lot of people who normally wouldn't have gotten involved. And it was new and exciting and very different. And you had people like H.G. Wells, who were reading, who were adherents to this idea of evolution. So there's a lot going on there. And that was just one more of the things. We had mathematical upheavals. You had Charles Babbage come out and try to create the first non-human calculator. Before Charles Babbage had done this, people who did calculations were called calculators. And Babbage created he created some machines that would calculate for people, but he also created some theoretical machines that he never got to see made. And I will most likely show you guys these in a future time, but Charles Babbage's difference engine was finally created in the 2000s, and it wasn't theoretical anymore, and it actually worked. And it wasn't the first computer, but Charles Babbage was credited with creating the first computer, which worked on punch cards, which worked along, strangely enough, with a loom in the textile industry to create different patterns. So you had a lot of technology going on. And then, of course, by the end of the Victorian era, you had cars. You had Ford coming out with cars. You had the Wright brothers flying. You you had a lot of different things. So you can see the technology moving along pretty quickly. In the same time frame, the Victorian era, you had not just things that were going on in Britain, but things that were going on in America. And generally speaking, there was no other name for the Victorian era other than the Victorian era. It was really a time frame. Um, in America, the biggest thing we had going on there towards the end of it was the American Civil War. And in terms of naming eras, we usually will call it the antebellum period, which is the time before the Civil War is called antebellum. And usually the time after the Civil War is called the Reformation or the Reconstruction, not the Reformation, the Reconstruction, sorry. The Reconstruction um, where the North went into the South and started reconstructing it to bring it back into the Union. But you had a lot of things going on in America, that whole westward movement as America opened up, as we gained all this new land that we purchased uh, and from we purchased or conquered from other places. And you had the manifest destiny, the idea that it was our destiny as Americans to move out and spread out across the land and make the most of it. So you heard a lot that, go west, young man, that whole thing. You had in 1849 the gold rush out in California, the 49ers, um, people seeking their fortune and, kind of basically doing the same things that some of those people wanted to do when the Industrial Revolution started, which was go and seek their own fortune and have something of their own. The idea of ownership is very strong, I think, with people in general. So it was quite the motivator. But when you think of the Wild Wild West, that was what was going on in America during the Victorian times. You also had the American Industrial Revolution going on, where we had many of the same things that were happening in the cities in England happening here in our big cities on the east, from textiles to just about anything you can think of being made and produced here. So there was quite a bit going on, politically, economically, uh, obviously kind of all over the place. But all of these things, the Victorian era and everything that makes up the Victorian era, that is what steampunk draws on for its aesthetic. Um, so you'll see American steampunks tend to have a more Wild West feel to them. There's a little more, well, I mean, for lack of a better word, Americanized feel to it. And European steampunks will be much more Victorian, much more staid, um, less adventurous per se, but it kind of goes without saying that Americans were pretty adventurous. So in any case, that is the down and dirty, the low and dirty on the Industrial Revolution and Victorianism. There's quite a bit there to talk about, and if you look on these two websites that I've given you, there's a lot of rabbit holes you can go down, and you're of course welcome to do any research that you find interesting with that. But that is, like I said, the quick and easy guide to Victorianism, the Industrial Revolution, and why it's important to steampunk. Uh, Victorian era, like I said, we saw the rise of authors like H.G. Wells and Jules Verne, and they are the progenitors of science fiction as we know it. And much of the science fiction that is in steampunk, ray guns, time travel, uh, submarines, all of these things came from the science fiction of those Victorian writers. And we'll talk more about that when we go into Victorian science fiction. But it was a very interesting time, a lot going on, and I hope that you find it interesting at least a little bit. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know. And you can always go into our general discussion board questions and ask a question there. I will try to be sure to look at that as much as possible and answer that. And, you know, feel free to answer something there too if you're a student and you know what the answer is. Go ahead, put it. So in any case, let me know if you have any questions. Enjoy looking at the Industrial Revolution and the Victorians.